There we go. Awesome. All right. Hey, folks, thanks so much for joining us here today. My name is Lee Habeger, and I'm the Executive Director for Seafood Harvesters of America. We're a national commercial fishing association representing 20 fishing organizations from around the country, Alaska to Hawaii to Florida to New England. I'm joined here by a host of esteemed colleagues. Allison Loring is the Senior Manager for U.S. Fisheries and Ocean Policy at the Environmental Defense Fund. And we have three panelists here, Aubrey Church, Dr. Andrew Thompson, and Dr. Glen Gawarkiewicz. Today is our second webinar in a four-part series on climate change and fisheries. Dr. Gawarkiewicz is a physical oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. His research is focused on processes occurring at the edge of the continental shelf. His research interests include ocean observatories, scientific use of autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, cooperative research with the commercial fishing industry. He's done extensive amounts of this in Southern New England with many of Harvesters members. You'll hear about this today. And he also researches the impacts of ocean warming on ocean processes and fisheries. Aubrey Church joined the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance in February as their new fisheries policy manager. Prior to that, Aubrey worked as a research biologist at the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation in Rhode Island, where she led the lobster and Jonah crab research fleet and CFRF Hui Shelf Research Fleet alongside Glen, which involves commercial fishermen in collecting biological and environmental data while out at sea. Her interests include collaborative research with the commercial fishing industry and bringing fishermen's knowledge and expertise to the decision-making process by taking part in both state and federal fisheries management efforts that span the entire East Coast. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Andrew Thompson, who is a NOAA fisheries biologist at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in La Jolla. His research focuses on elucidating processes that affect the recruitment and assemblage dynamics of marine fisheries. Andrew is part of the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigation, also referred to as CalCOFFIE. CalCOFFIE is a program that has been systematically and continuously monitoring larval fisheries in the California current ecosystem since 1951. Most of his current research uses CalCOFFIE samples either by analyzing existing data on fish abundance or creating new data from CalCOFFIE samples by, for example, determining the identity of larval rock fishes using genetic approaches. He is particularly interested in elucidating mechanisms that impact fish assemblage structure and recruitment dynamics. Dr. Thompson is replacing Dr. Scott Goodman on the webinar today. Dr. Goodman does a lot of cooperative research up in the Bering Sea, so you will hear from him in our next webinar, I think in a week or two. So if you're joining here today to listen to Scott, you'll hear him in just a couple weeks, so stay tuned for that. And then a couple of housekeeping things. So like if you joined us on the first one, our first webinar, after our presentations here today, we'll have time for Q&A and any other discussion points that folks want to bring up about the presentations you learned today, or any questions you have kind of more broadly about science and fisheries in this area of climate change. Again, we are recording this webinar, but only the presentation portion. This recording will be posted on our YouTube after, probably give me 24 hours, it'll be posted tomorrow afternoon. So folks will be able to access that presentation later. Again, your questions, the Q&A questions will not be recorded. If you decide to ask a question during the presentation, that will be recorded. So just weigh that if you want to wait. You are all muted and off camera. That is on purpose. If you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A part of the webinar, or if you have a clarifying question during a presentation, you can put that in the Q&A box. Allison and I will be monitoring that, or you can use the raise hand function and we'll be monitoring the participant list where we'll see that hand raised. The hand raise function is found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then Allison or I will unmute you, and then you can come off camera if you'd like, and then you'll be able to ask your question. There is no chat function. So if you have questions, again, Any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that. We'll work to squeeze in any of those clarifying questions during the presentation. So with that, Glenn and Aubrey, how about you all kick us off? And then Andrew, you'll follow.
Okay, great. So I will kick us off. Let me just share my screen, make sure that that's good. All right, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we got you, Aubrey.
Okay, great. Awesome. So thank you very much for the introduction. So today I'll be touching base on the CFRF Hui Shelf Research Fleet that I work closely with Glenn on. This was in partnership with the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in Rhode Island, and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So this was a place dear to my heart from several years of working there. So today I'm kind of talking about work that I had done previously at a prior employment. Just talking a little bit about myself and my role in my current position. As of February, I am the policy manager at the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance. And at the Fishermen's Alliance, we really believe that fishermen possess the solutions to the challenges they face, whether that's improvements to fishing regulations, making sure that we're involved in more collaborative research or educational programs. Our work is really guided by the energy and expertise of commercial fishermen on the water. Last year, myself, or not myself, other staff, spent several days at regulatory meetings and webinars, bringing fishermen's knowledge and expertise to the decision-making table. We really want to make sure we're navigating those policies and regulatory decisions so that fishermen can spend their valuable time on the water. We've been working for more than 30 years to meet the emerging challenges that fishermen face. Our fisheries support a really strong economy and provide a healthy local source of seafood. Fishing is an integral part of Cape Cod's heritage, but also of the East Coast and many coastal communities that you're involved in. And these industries have facilitated the growth of many of our coastal communities. So myself and others, we really believe that we need to advocate for healthy, vibrant fisheries, strong working waterfronts, and resilient coastal communities. I'm currently taking action now to make sure that there is a future for fish and fishermen by working towards a healthy ocean environment and sustainable fishing practices, making sure we're supporting our small boat fishing fleet and making sure that they have a voice. We want to engage in fisherman-driven science and have them be a part of the research. That's really important. And investing in fisheries to provide opportunities for today's fishermen, but also future generations so that they can build successful businesses. So to get started, I really wanted to talk about marine species and how they respond to warming. Climate change is often described as this global phenomenon, but we all know it's really begun to affect people and their environments at both regional and local scales. The waters surrounding southern New England, where I'm located, are some of the most productive in the world. And as these waters warm, there's concerns that have been raised about how this is going to impact fishery resources and the people who depend on them. As a result, there's really an urgent need now more than ever to better understand the environmental changes that are taking place and how these are going to impact people and fisheries and the ecosystem. Marine species can respond to warming in different ways. They can shift their distribution northward or offshore and deeper into cooler waters, such as lobster. They could increase in abundance and be kind of climate winners, and their range could expand, like black sea bass or Jonah crab. Or they may decrease in abundance, or their range could be constricted, and that could be like Atlantic cod. So as I mentioned previously, I spent about 7 years working for the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, and in 2014, they developed the CFRF Hui Shelf Research Fleet. And this was really, the main goal was to help us understand the ongoing changes that fishermen are seeing on the water. Fishermen wanted to collect much needed climate data so that scientists could have a better understanding of how this would impact fisheries. So the project aims to assess the frequency and timing and extent of onshore penetration of warm, salty intrusions of slope and Gulf Stream water onto the continental shelf. And so we give fishermen the tools to collect information at sea. And so they collect temperature, depth, and salinity information from 6 study zones. And so this is the CTD, this conductivity temperature depth instrument. So in practice, fishermen deploy these CTDs, as you can see on the left-hand side. Again, that's conductivity temperature depth instrument while they're fishing. And then they're able to view the profile right there on the right-hand side where they can get the temperature, depth, and salinity. Many of the guys that we have worked with have been on the water for decades, and they are witnessing these changes daily. They are curious about what's driving these changes, and this gives them the opportunity to work with scientists. In my opinion, fishermen are scientists. Every day they're recording their logbook, what they're seeing, what they caught, any unusual catch. So by utilizing fishermen's time on the water and the knowledge of the ocean environment, we can develop a better understanding of this highly dynamic area. The benefits of this type of project is that fishermen can automatically view the temperature when the instrument comes on board, and then scientists are able to access near real-time data. So the more we learn, the better choices we can make to manage and support our fisheries. So on the CFRF webpage, our data is always publicly available. And so when I worked there, I would send the data to Glen and other oceanographers at WHOI, like Frank Barr, and they would process that data, and then it would be posted on a website that's accessible for the public. So here's an example of, as of last week, in August 22nd, there was 833 profiles since the start of the program. And these are the 6 study zones. So the 2 closest to shore are zones 1 and 2. In the middle, we call those zones 3 and 4. And the farthest offshore is zones 5 and 6. And the zones 5 and 6 were partially overlapped with the Ocean Observatories Institute Coastal Pioneer Array. That was a system of moorings, gliders, and autonomous underwater vehicles. And that has been, or was in effect since 2013, but that has been recently going to be relocated to the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And then another benefit of the Shelf Oceanographic Research Fleet is that they host usually 2 meetings, sometimes 3 oceanographic meetings a year with the fishing industry. And this is not just for fleet participants that are involved in the program, but open to the fishing community. And it's widely attended. It's an opportunity for fishermen to share with Glen, as well as other scientists who are interested from NOAA, about what they're seeing on the water, what unusual changes, what's going on, but also discuss the data that they've been collecting. And then Glen helps translate that scientific data into something that fishermen can understand and how that's going to impact their fishing year in the future, but also any kind of future research projects that need to be done to better understand what's going on in our environment. Here's an overview of bottom water temperature by zone. So on the y-axis is fishing zone with zone 1 at the top. So again, that's the closest to shore, and then all the way down to zone 6, which is the farthest offshore over time. And then temperature, the darker the color is, the higher the temperature in the 70s, if it's in the red, for temperature in Fahrenheit. And what you'll be able to see is an example from June 2021, where we're really able to capture and understand what these warm core rings are bringing this warm saline water close to shore. And here's another example of a profile for salinity by zone. Similarly, again, the closest on top, all the way down to farthest offshore, and the higher salinity is in red. And this is another example. Kind of digging in deeper, this is 3 Shelf Research Fleet conductivity temperature depth profiles that were from a recent paper by Noel Olson et al. And it's listed here on the bottom from Frontiers in Marine Science, recently published. But the red Shelf Fleet profile is bottom intrusion from January 2017. And I should mention that on the left-hand side is depth and temperature, and then the one to the right is depth and salinity. And the farther down is deep, so that's why it's a bottom intrusion right there. And this brought really warm, salty water onto the continental shelf, and it reached as far north as Block Island, which was about 100 kilometers shoreward of the shelf break. And this really led to a documentation of a warm core ring-induced marine heat wave, which created a 4-month period of temperature warm anomalies. And during that time, fishermen reported unusual bycatch, such as Gulf Stream flounder and juvenile black sea bass. Looking at the blue line, similarly, again, temperature on the left, right is salinity. Another bottom water intrusion was observed by the Shelf Research Fleet from December 2020. And one of our Shelf Fleet participants noticed this really affected the monkfish catch that year. Another lobsterman reported 58 degrees on the bottom, which seemed to shut off his Jonah crab catch. So these are some of the kind of observations that fishermen are trying to tie temperature and salinity to their fisheries. And finally, the black one is from September 2021. And you can see kind of the difference between the red and blue, where the intrusion was at the bottom. This is in the middle of the water column. So this is just an example of what a mid-depth intrusion might look like. So ocean data really gives fishermen an advantage. You know, when this project first started, the data was transferred to Woods Hole once the fishermen landed, and then fishermen would wait for their 2 meetings a year where they would get presentations by Glen, and it would help them translate the data and understand what was going on for fishing. But today, fishermen are really alerting scientists first of what they're seeing on unusual temperatures or salinity, often citing the phenomenon by name, which I find fascinating and really exciting. So they'll say, oh my gosh, I think it's a warm core ring, or it's a salinity maximum intrusion, because they know based on the temperature and salinity characteristics that something unusual is going on. We've had numerous media interactions, and I really just wanted to show some screenshots from some of our articles, but mainly this quote that I think is really important. And this is from Mark Schweitzer, and he's one of our fleet participants. But he says, we're already traversing these waters. It's a relatively simple thing to do to collect this data. The more you learn, the more you understand about the environmental conditions in which we live, the better choices that can be made about how to manage our oceans. So, I think many guys really believe in collecting this data and being part of this partnership. Here's another example from September 2020. This is just where there was an instance of one single CTD drop to the ocean seafloor where there was 4 salinity maximum intrusions. So those mid-depth profiles you were seeing on previous slides, there was 4 of them and one single drop, which we thought was kind of unusual, but fishermen were seeing a ton of octopus, lots of jellyfish, but these are just an example. In December, there was a ring of warm water that was 60 miles wide that broke away from the Gulf Stream and displaced cold water species. This is just a sea surface temperature image, but the idea that you can see these really warm core ring coming farther onshore. But many lobstermen relocated their traps to cooler waters, and others used the information to save costs of going fishing. So we had a gill netter that, based on this information and the profiles he was doing, decided it was better to stay in instead of going for monkfish. And here's just another quote. I won't read through it, but really, fishermen feel that they're collecting real-time data nonstop, and they're just hoping that this will plot a course of action for individuals and fleets so that they can adapt and be resilient. And I think that that's a great message. As I mentioned, we've had a ton of media, and the reason why I added this slide is just often the fishermen and the fishing industry can be portrayed in a negative light in media, and this is a perfect example of positives. Fishermen believing in the partnership with scientists and managers for a better outcome. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that we really are proud of our fishermen, and we couldn't do these type of work without them. And kind of in summary, the benefit fishermen have for access to data, they're able to combine their traditional knowledge with the scientific perspective. They can use these temperature and salinity readings to adjust their course, look for fish in areas that may be likely to withstand this warm and salty water. They're also part of the conversation, and that builds trust and transparency and a mutual respect. And they also have access and ownership of the data, which is really important. It just doesn't get sent off and then they never get to see it again. And for scientists, it's incredibly valuable. One, of course, it's a cost-effective way to collect oceanographic data. Hydrographic research cruises are expensive, but it's also getting that partnership, and you're getting that real-time information that you wouldn't get otherwise, because many of these surveys only go a few times a year. Fishermen have enormous wealth of knowledge about their local water and the weather conditions, both past and present. So they're an incredibly valuable resource, and they're very attuned to what they're catching. And so, if you can get anything out of my talk today, it's just the value of the partnership between fishermen and scientists towards a common goal. And just with that, I'd like to highlight the participant vessels from the CFRF research fleet, the Brooks Sea, the Finest Kind 2, and the Excalibur. Some of the collaborators at WHOI, at NIMS, and the UMass Dartmouth School for Marine Science and Technology, and my other co-authors. And because this is, a program that I'm no longer involved in, as I have moved on from the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, I want to make sure that if people are interested in learning more about the research fleet directly, NOAA Olson is the lead for that project, and her information is right there. So she'd be happy to answer other further questions that I might not be able to answer today. And with that, I'll stop sharing and let Glenn continue with the second half of this presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aubrey. Let me get my screen share going here. Okay. One more second. Okay, and so I want to talk about the regional circulation very briefly, then ocean warming and marine heat waves, and a really, really critical change, which is the increase in stratification, the density differences from the surface to bottom, because it's completely changing how the deep ocean affects the continental shelf. And I'll talk about Gulf Stream variability, and then the last slide or two, I'll briefly mention the strange conditions this year. So in the Northeast, there's 2 really important current systems: the Gulf Stream, which is a western boundary current, and it's very wide, very strong, very important in carrying heat up poleward there. But there's another important current system, the shelf break jet, that runs along the edge of the continental shelf. And that brings cold, fresh water down from the Labrador shelf. It's part of a current system that goes all the way around Greenland, actually, and connects back into the Arctic Ocean. The shelf break jet is very dynamic. It forms eddies there, like this cartoon right here. But a really, really critical process occurs when warm core rings or clockwise eddies break off of the Gulf Stream and then move along the edge of the continental shelf there. They can form what are called streamers of shelf water that go around the warm core rings, and that they tend to concentrate marine life. The shelf break jet, which is denoted by the ice attacks here, is generally about a quarter to a half a knot to the southwest. It's not very wide, and it's associated with the large temperature and salinity gradients in the shelf break front itself. And it's primarily the density differences between that fresh shelf water and the salty water offshore that drives the current. So this is a schematic cartoon here of processes that occur at the edge of the continental shelf. I'll be talking about these mid-depth salinity maximum intrusions a little bit later and how we're using the shelf research fleet data. But a really key issue about the shelf break front is that the bottom boundary layer actually detaches and causes continuous upwelling into the heart of that jet, which is why the 100-fathom line is so important. That's pretty much the mean position of the shelf break jet there. And I note that warm core rings have a much larger vertical scale than the edge of the continental shelf. So they don't actually travel onto the continental shelf, but they can drive the bottom intrusions, as Aubrey showed in some of the data there. And there's also shelf water eddies that move offshore. This cartoon pretty much encapsulates my entire career, which is why I'm always careful not to delete this figure. And Aubrey gave a nice overview of the fleet there. And she mentioned how important the dialogue is. And one of the surprising developments out of working with the Shelf Research Fleet was getting involved with an informal group called the Squid Squad. And this was a group that provided the scientific working group report for the short fin squid stock assessment last year. The leaders were Kim Hyde and Sarah Solois of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And what happened was we enjoyed talking to each other so much that we just kept talking after the scientific working group's report was submitted. And so during the fishing season, we talk every Friday morning at 10 a.m. So it's great for me as an academic to hear up to the day reports on where the vessels are going, what they're finding. We make suggestions about where squid might be found there. And the scientific working group report ended up being published as a peer-reviewed paper in Fisheries Oceanography. And it showed that the presence of warm core rings was the #1 factor regarding the largest 10% of the catches of ilex there. Another thing there is that the Squid Squad actually contributed to MSC certification of the squid on the East Coast there. And we were very, very proud of that. Okay, marine heat waves are when temperature is in the top 10% of observations over the previous 30 years for that day in that spot. It's generally defined with remotely sensed satellite data. But the point here in the figure on the left, this is actually a plot of the warming trends in the Northeast, and the marine heat waves contribute to this pattern. But there's two main regions of warming. One is right off of George's Bank right here over the continental slope. This is an area where warm core rings tend to stick, actually. And as we'll see in a minute, there's a lot more warm core rings now than there were 20 years ago. The second area, which has not been investigated as thoroughly, is this warming right down the axis of the Gulf Stream as it separates from Cape Hatteras. The person in the office next to mine, Robert Todd, has a paper on glider data about that. I believe it's under review right now. On the right-hand side, these are the total marine heat wave days per year. This is 1980 to 2020 right here. And you can see that in recent years, there's been a big increase in both the number of days as well as the intensity from these marine heat waves. Now, one thing that's very important to me as a physical oceanographer is how the density has decreased near the surface as the coastal ocean gets warmer. And this plot right here shows where there's statistically significant trend in changes in density. The surface density has decreased by a fair amount over the 2003 to 2013 time period. This was from a paper published in 2020. It's even more buoyant than that. In this year in particular, the surface density has been very, very buoyant. This is important because what it means is that motions across the continental shelf are occurring much more frequently. Okay, now I mentioned that warm core rings are important. The Gulf Stream is getting much more variable. And there was a nice paper in 2016 about the increasing wiggliness of the Gulf Stream. This is the envelope of all north wall positions from 1995 versus 2014. And you can see it was much straighter back in 1995. We're getting situations where the north wall of the Gulf Stream is actually hitting the shelf break, and of course disrupting lobster and crab fishing there. Associated with this is a big regime shift in the year 2000, which Vijay Gangopadhyay and his group at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth has extensively documented, when the number of warm core rings jumped from 18 per year to 33 per year. And we're currently investigating why that happened. It's not associated with changes in the wind field there. Okay, and now I want to talk about one specific ocean process that we've examined pretty closely using the shelf fleet data. And that's these mid-depth salinity maximum intrusions. And so this is depth right here, and then salinity. This is real data, but it's a schematic. And you can see that we've defined several characteristics. S-max is the maximum salinity in the intrusion. There's a delta S, which is the difference between the ambient salinity and that S-max there. And then there's the thickness as well as the depth at which this. Aubrey and I actually worked together there along with Frank Barr and Paula Fratantoni at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to document where out of the shelf fleet profiles these intrusions occurred. And in this plot, the green dots have these intrusions and the black dots do not. The thing that was shocking when I first plotted this during the early days of the panic was that these intrusions now are getting up to 100 kilometers or 60 nautical miles onshore of the shelf break. This did not happen before. They used to be limited to about 15 nautical miles. And so this Gulf Stream water is getting much further onshore. In addition, we found that in an earlier climatology published in 2003, the frequency never got up above about 25% of profiles for a given month, whereas we're approaching 50% of profiles in the 2015 to 2019 period there. So it's been a 70% increase in the frequency of these intrusions. And as Aubrey mentioned earlier, you can get up to 4 intrusions in a single profile, which must affect the vertical distribution of zooplankton there. And then finally, we can also use the shelf fleet data to look at not just seasonal averages, but also year to year, month to month. And we can see that 2019 during September had the largest number of these intrusions, I would not be surprised at all if the frequency hasn't even gone up in the past year or two. And then finally, we had a paper published as part of Adrian Silver's PhD thesis, working with Avijit Gangopillai. And she compared to warm core ring presence to these salinity intrusions over 30 years and found that 72% of these intrusions were associated with a ring in close proximity there. And this was much more than you would expect from random occurrences there. So to wrap up, how is the shelf fleet data being used? And Aubrey covered that pretty nicely. I think monkfish is a good example. When you have the bottom intrusions, Rob Waltz and others have found that the monkfish tend not to be caught there. And these 2 or 3 time a year meetings have been incredible in terms of talking about how a season is going, how it compares to the previous year, how storms come into play, how Gulf Stream variability is important. The direct input into the stock assessment for the short fin squid resulted in the 21% increase to the annual quota. We were very, very proud about that. And the Squid Squad has been asked to participate in the upcoming assessment for longfin squid in 2025. So looking forward, 2023 has just been remarkable in terms of the warming rate. The North Atlantic is 4 or 5 standard deviations above normal, which is enormous. We have the El Nino present in the Central Pacific. And I wrote this slide actually in June, but the weather patterns are likely to be unusual, possibly unprecedented through summer and fall. Those heat domes this summer were just remarkable, and they steered lows around them, which I'm not sure had been seen before. You know, this all has effects on the coastal ocean. And most importantly, we really need to keep trying to increase our subsurface measurements there, because the ocean is changing very rapidly. And if we're going to understand what's happening in the ecosystem, we need to know what's happening with the temperature and salinity. And finally, my last point is that we do have a pending sea grant proposal to expand the shelf research fleet to Aubrey's new shop there in Chatham. And we have all our fingers crossed that we'll be able to do that. So thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Andrew, you're up.
All right, let's roll. Let me share my screen here. All righty, let's give this a go. All right, so we're going to switch directions now, literally, and move over to the west coast of the United States and the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And
Andrew,
I want to just take.
Sorry
Yeah,
to interrupt you. We're still seeing your whole screen. I don't know if you can start the presentation.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint?
Now I can't see anything.
Okay. Let's try again. I'm sorry. Oh, how about entire screen? Sorry.
That's all right.
Can you see it now?
Yes, we just see all the slides on the left-hand side and like the whole PowerPoint application.
Okay. So if I do share screen, does that, or is it up now?
We still see the whole PowerPoint app, which is, I mean, that's okay. That's fine.
That's really strange.
I've seen this happen before, and I don't know how they troubleshooted it. Troubleshot?
That's really weird. I'm seeing the. Okay, let me try one more time.
Okay.
Can you see the presentation now?
I see a white screen.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay. And not now either, I imagine.
Nope, still a white screen.
Okay. Let me go back and I think that best thing I can do is probably just show you the darn it. I'm flustered.
That's all right. If you just want to pull up the PowerPoint, we can just we can work off of that. That's great.
Okay.
We can see the slide, so.
Okay, I think that might be as good as we're gonna get.
Yeah,
okay?
that's totally fine. Yep.
Okay, I'll just go with this. Okay, so
Perfect.
we're gonna move over to the West Coast and talk a little bit about what's been going on lately in the Pacific Ocean, and specifically some what we call ecological surprises that occurred during our recent run of warm weather. So as we mentioned earlier, I work for NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in La Jolla. And I'm part of the group that's called CalCOFI, which is the California Cooperative Fisheries Investigation Program. And we've been monitoring larval fish and oceanography in the California current ecosystem since 1949. So we have the longest running survey of marine fishes in the world. On the bottom left here, you can see sort of our grid pattern. So we have a lot of different stations that we go to. And we have plankton that's in the water. Yeah?
I'm so sorry. Can you speak up just a little bit? I think a couple
Yeah.
folks are having a hard time hearing.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. No worries. Thanks.
Okay. So, like I said, I'm part of the CalCOFI program, and we've been monitoring larval fish and oceanography in the California current ecosystem since 1949. And what we do is we drop nets into the water, plankton nets in the water, and then we look at the contents of the plankton and specifically the larval fish in the laboratory under the microscope, and we track the abundances of over 800 fishes. And we've been doing this since the late 1940s. So this is the longest running survey of marine fishes in the world. So in addition to CalCOFI, there's several other NOAA-run fisheries independent surveys in the California current ecosystem. And the California current ecosystem basically is comprised of the west coast of the United States and southern and Baja California. And what happens here is that we have a subarctic current, a North Pacific current, that runs eastward. And when it hits the coast of North America, it bifurcates and becomes the Alaska current in the north and the California current in the south. And much like the shelfbreak current on the East Coast, the California current transports cold, nutrient-rich and oxygen-rich water southwards. And so this can be an important source of productivity for fishes and lower trophic level species in the California current. So this slide is going to look familiar because Glenn showed one that looked almost the same for the East Coast of the United States. But basically, we've been in a warm state since about 2013 in the North Pacific. So by the North Pacific, I'm talking about this box here in the North Pacific Ocean. And then specifically within the California current large marine ecosystem, which is this area along the coast, we've also seen predominantly warm conditions since 2014. And if you take a look at the satellite images as of Tuesday, you can see that we are indeed engulfed in warm conditions throughout most of the Pacific. So we have the El Nino signature down here, which is defined by warming along the equator. And this water has propagated northwards into the California current ecosystem from the south. And then in addition, we have what we call a blob of warm water, which formed in the Gulf of Alaska region. That's been propagating south, such that now the entire West Coast is pretty much engulfed in warm water. Okay, so how has this warming over the last, say, decade or so affected the fisheries. I want to provide you with 3 case studies from the California current ecosystem. The first one is going to look at sardines and anchovies, which are small coastal pelagic fishes. The second is a look at what's been going on with rockfishes. And the third is an interesting case study of what happened to the hake fishery in recent years. Okay, so let's start with sardines and anchovies. So sardines have been a really important part of the economy of the west coast of California for over 100 years. So in the 1920s to the 1940s, sardines were intensely fished, and they were a very important food component for the troops in World War I and World War II. Cannery Row in Monterey Bay, California, was basically the entire economy of that town was driven by the fishery catch for sardines. And even today, sardines are an important fishery in California and the west coast of the United States when they're around. Anchovy are also a small pelagic fish. They're smaller than sardines, and they live for a shorter amount of time, but they do serve similar ecosystem roles. They can be highly abundant and are very important for numerous marine predators, such as whales and sea lions and seabirds. Anchovies were fished in the United States from the 1960s to the 1980s, mostly as a reduction fishery. And both of these species naturally undergo boom and bust cycles. So times when they're very, very abundant for decades on end, and then times when they're very scarce. And we know that this has occurred historically prior to any fishing, because we can see scale depositions of sardines and anchovies and sediments that are collected from the Santa Barbara Channel. And you can see that from the year 1000 AD to 1500 AD, there are periods where sardines were very abundant, periods where they were very low, and similarly periods where anchovies were very abundant and periods where anchovies were very low. Okay, so this is a look at the number of larval fish we see per station for both anchovies and sardines. So anchovies are on the left and sardines are on the right. So when Cal Coffee began in 1951, anchovies were pretty scarce, but they rebounded quickly in the 50s and reached really high levels that basically were maintained in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. However, in the late 80s / early 90s, the anchovy population collapsed, and it was very low for most of the 2000s, with the exception of around 2003, 2004, and 2005, where they had a brief, short-lived rebound. Sardine, on the other hand, were low going into Cal Coffee. Cal Coffee was actually formed to try to figure out what happened to the sardines when they collapsed and caused economic havoc in the Monterey Bay region and throughout the west coast of the US. And we can see that from the first basically 30, 40 years of Cal Coffee, sardine were scarce in US waters. But then they began to recover in the 1980s. And by the time the 1990s rolled around, they were actually at pretty high levels, and a fishery reformed. However, the fishery collapsed and sardines went way down in the 2010s. And by 2014, sardines were very low again. So we had a period where both sardines and anchovies were low in the early 2010s. So what causes sardine and anchovy to increase or decrease? Well, in the early 2000s, we thought we had a really good handle on this. And there was a really well-known paper by Francisco Chavez and colleagues, which basically found that across the globe, sardines tended to be high when you had periods of persistent warm weather and warm waters. And anchovies, he postulated, were doing the opposite. Anchovies increased when it was cold. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we had a marine heat wave that began in late 2013 and lasted through 2016. And this figure from Mike Jacobs's paper shows its evolution. It started in the Gulf of Alaska and then slowly moved throughout the year in 2014 to the West Coast. And by 2015, the West Coast was subsumed by warm water from this blob of warm water. And then in 2015, an El Nino joined in. And so you had warm water coming in from the south. And so through 2015 and 16, there was warm water basically surrounding the west coast of North America for 3 years. And when it was all said and done, this was the warmest 3-year period on record, going back to over 100 years. So what happened to sardines and anchovies? Based on our previous expectations that sardines like it warm and anchovies like it cold, we would have predicted that probably sardines would increase under these conditions. However, exactly the opposite happened. What happened was that going through 2021 and into the present day, sardines have remained very low and anchovies have actually increased. And so right now, anchovies are about as abundant as we've ever seen off the west coast of North America. And so, interestingly enough, when the sardines collapsed, the fishery was finally closed in 2015. And so this was actually a pretty large blow to economically to the small pelagic fishery in California. And an anchovy fishery has not emerged. So even though the ocean is full of anchovy right now off the west coast of North America, there's not a large commercial anchovy fishery. And so this is actually kind of an interesting situation because I don't know if we've ever seen in the last 100 years a species like anchovy or sardine be super abundant and not fished in any location throughout the world. So we'll see how this goes. But basically, what I'm trying to understand is the reason that the anchovy increased. And so basically, this boils down to the survival of their eggs and larvae. So we know that survival of larval anchovy was very high from 2014 to 2016. And as a result, the abundance of juveniles was also high. Anchovies begin spawning when they're about 1 year old. And so the high adult population started to reproduce in 2016 after the first recruit class was matured to begin spawning. And so a big focus of the research that I'm doing and my group is doing is to try and understand what went right for anchovy since 2014. And we've got some work that's in progress trying to get at that question. But I'm going to shift gears now and talk about another species. But first of all, I want to talk about what recruits are in fisheries. So the definition of a recruit can vary, but basically it's when a fish reaches a life history stage when mortality, natural mortality, isn't very, very, very high as it is when they're larvae. So most larvae die, over 99% of larvae from most species don't make it to become recruits, but you can have really high recruitment in some years, but those recruitment events are intermittent. You don't typically have high recruitment in every year, and so intermittent high recruitment events typically drive the adult populations for years to come for most pelagic fishes. So let's switch gears and talk about rockfish recruitment now. So rockfish is another species which is fished off the west coast of North America. And it's a very important component of both the recreational fishery, particularly in Southern California, and the commercial fishery, more so in the north in the California current ecosystem. And the species of rockfishes which are caught by fisheries typically live for decades. They're long-lived species. And as such, the adult population size is affected by fishing and by recruitment dynamics. So years when you have high survival of larvae to become pelagic juveniles, when mortality is a lot less. And so we have another program at NOAA that samples pelagic juvenile rockfishes throughout California, Oregon, and Washington. And based on analysis of this data from 1983 to 2010, we see that recruitment of rockfishes tends to be synergistic and correlated among species. So if one species has high recruitment, then it's likely others will as well. And Ralston showed that recruitment tends to be high when they're exposed to cold, southward flowing water, specifically that of the California current. And it tended to be that this cold, southward flowing water was suppressed in warm years, such as when El Niños took place. So for example, during the 97, 98 El Nino, the recruitment of rockfishes was very low. Okay, so what happened to rockfish recruitment in the warm 2014 and 2016 years? Well, again, unexpectedly, recruitment was actually really high, both in the year preceding the marine heat wave in 2013, but then it remained high throughout the marine heat wave years. And in particular, a species which is not fished, and it's kind of unusual for rockfish, it's schooling and could be really abundant. Short-belly rockfishes, their recruitment was the highest ever recorded since the early 80s. And even though, and so this paper by Schroeder et al. Was really interesting in that it found that even though it was really warm on average throughout the Pacific and the California current ecosystem, there were still pockets of cool southward flowing California current water at depths that reached the locations where the adult rockfishes were living from 2014 to 2016. So we had high rockfish recruitment during the marine heat wave, which was not what I would have predicted would happen. So then let's talk about one more case study. And this is another interesting interaction of disparate events, seemingly, but it affects the Pacific hake fishery. So Pacific hake are very commercially valuable off Oregon, Washington, and Canada, not so much in California. And one of the stipulations for the hake fishery is that there's limits for bycatch, and specifically there's limits for bycatch of short-belly rockfishes. And historically, short-belly rockfish were pretty low or absent off of Oregon and Washington. And so the bycatch limits were set at pretty low levels. However, by 2018, all of a sudden there was a swarm of short-belly rockfishes that were being taken as bycatch by the hake fishery. And so this was probably caused by the extremely high recruitment off California, and then the warmer waters connecting to Oregon and Washington, which seemingly caused short-belly to move north and interact with the hake fishery. So in 2018, the hake fishery had exceeded the short-belly bycatch within the first 2 weeks of the fishing season. And so what happened then was that the Pacific Fisheries Management Council had to make a rapid decision in season to raise the bycatch limit to prevent the fishery from closing. So that was an interesting thing that I observed. So to wrap it up, 2014 and 2016, the marine heat waves that we experienced in the North Pacific were the warmest ever recorded. And historically, anchovy and sardine, historically sardine recruitment tended to be high during warm years, but that didn't happen during the marine heat wave. Instead, anchovy, which typically were thought to be associated with more cold water conditions, boomed during the marine heat wave and in subsequent years. And now we have an ocean full of anchovy, and sardines are still low. Historically, rockfish recruitment was low in warm years when cold southward flowing water was low, but rockfish recruitment was extremely high both before in 2013 and during the marine heat wave. And this seemed to be caused by there being quite a bit of the southward flowing cold water depth in the system where it was reaching adult rockfishes. And then finally, short-belly bycatch was historically very low in the hake fishery, but in 2018, the hake fishery exceeded the bycatch limits in the first 2 weeks of the season. And so the Pacific Fisheries Management Council had to step in and make an in-season adjustment to keep the fishery open. And so one of the lessons that we're learning is that it's difficult to make fisheries predictions when you encounter unprecedented environmental conditions in a system as complicated as the California current ecosystem. And a lot of the fishery impacts that we saw during these recent marine heat wave years were highly nuanced and not necessarily what we predicted. And so I guess it's important to keep monitoring the system to see what's going to happen next. Okay, I guess that moves us into a question and answer session.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. And thank you to all of our presenters here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording.